The notion that the government's intrusion into the economy is some sort of external influence, some sort of outside intrusion on what would be better left without such intrusions.
Oh my god, holy shit, there's a wolf! My, what bad arguments you make.
I would argue, based on a lifetime of work in the field we call economic history.
So a person who openly identifies as a Marxist, and someone who thinks replacing capitalism with communism or socialism is a good idea, is going to give us a lecture about economic history. Yeah, that's rich.
That this is a complete illusion. Strong government has been part of capitalism throughout its history.
There have been organized systems of trade long before government even existed. Government in its currently recognizable form began circa 5000 BC, give or take. There's evidence of organized systems of trade that go back way further than that.
It has been something both denounced by capitalists and yet eagerly embraced by them, usually at the same time.
And here we see that Mr. Wolff has a basic flawed understanding of what capitalism actually is. He's making the typical left-wing mistake of looking at our current corporatist system and assuming that that must be capitalism. Capitalism is an economic system based on private ownership and voluntary exchange. Now, of course, we do have certain aspects of that in our economy. We do have a certain degree of private ownership and voluntary exchange, but to a large extent, a lot of things that happen in our economy is involuntary. The government forcibly takes your money and gives it to big corporations. The government forcibly tells small businesses what to do so that it make it harder to compete with larger businesses, ostensibly in the name of consumer protection and regulation. Now, Mr. Wolff is correct to point out that large corporations usually do embrace the very government they often criticize. Big corporations are all too quick to embrace bailouts, subsidies, regulations that make it harder to compete with them, but he's trying to make it out as if this is what capitalists actually advocate for, which is blatantly false.
Nor is that all that unusual. We are often angry at the things we are most in need of, and we can live the contradiction between needing it and being angry about it all at the same time.
This presupposes, of course, that we are actually in need of what they're angry about. Now, of course, there are plenty of instances in which people may be showing hostility or aversion towards something they actually do need. For example, I'm not exactly fond of the way my medications taste when I take them, but I understand I still gotta take them. But if it turns out that we don't actually need what it is that they're angry about, well then their frustration is justified, because then you're trying to impose onto them something that they don't need. I can totally sympathize with the frustration of a business owner who may have a better way of doing something that's cheaper and more efficient, but is unable to do it or is forced to do something a different way because of a regulation.
And I think this is no exception. Let me give you some concrete examples.
Oh boy, here we go, the roads argument. He's going to list off something or a bunch of shit that the government does that the private sector can and often also does.
Nothing is more important to the modern functioning of a capitalist economy than money.
Yes, I would agree with that. Money is pretty important to a modern capitalist economy. So since it's so dang important to have an economy, I'd imagine there'd be quite a bit of demand for it, and therefore profit opportunities for someone to come along and provide that commodity.
But to whom do we entrust the production, distribution, and control of the money we use every day, all the time? The government.
So this is the is therefore ought fallacy. He's looking at the way things are currently done and assuming that that's the way it has to be done, or that there's no better alternative out there. Sure, under our current system, the government is entrusted with the power to create and distribute money, but that doesn't necessarily mean that only the government can create and distribute money.
We give the government an extraordinary power by being the only one allowed to print the money, to mint the coins, to set the interest rates, to determine how much money is in the economy.
And this has ended in nothing short of an unmitigated disaster. You see, because the monetary supply and interest rates are determined by the whim of politicians rather than actual market signals, this results in either too much money in the economy, which results in inflation, or too little money in the economy, which results in an increase in debt. Now, both of these, hyperinflation and hyperdebt, are some of the key factors that actually cause economic crashes.
And we do that because capitalism needs it.
Actually, the reason we do it is because the banksters and all the people who wield power benefit a lot more from the super centralized clusterfuck Federal Reserve System than they would under a system where currency was privatized. Because if currency was privatized, then they would have to actually worry about the value of their currency. They wouldn't be able to just print more of it on a whim, thus imposing the expense onto the rest of us via inflation.
In every capitalist country, there were times when lots of people were allowed to produce money.
Really? Well, that's certainly news to me. I don't recall at any point in the history of the United States, or any capitalist country for that matter, where the government just let private companies print currency.
And that produced a level of chaos that led in every country for one authority, the government, to be given that job.
Where? When? When specifically did this happen? Explain to me in detail exactly how it is that allowing for private industry to produce currency and giving consumers freedom of choice between what currency they want to use ever in any way led to chaos. If anything, it would create less chaos. Because private banks would be competing to have you use their currency instead of their competitors, there'd be an incentive for them to make sure it's not only high in value, but also stable in value.
And for everybody else to be told, if you print money yourself, we're going to put you in jail.
German, hello?
Ach, guten Morgen. My name is SpongeBob.
Say what?
Guten Morgen. My name is SpongeBob. Ik ben gekommen mijn oude heimat bezoeken.
So Professor Wolff here is failing to differentiate between currency and legal tender. They are different. You see, currency is simply just an agreed upon medium of exchange. It can be anything. Like if a bunch of people get together and say, alright, one Pokemon card is worth 5 Yu-Gi-Oh cards. Voila, you have currency. Now, in order for currency to be able to be used to pay off a public debt, for example your taxes, it has to be officially recognized by the government. That's legal tender. Now, the government can't stop you from producing your own currency. It's impossible. That would literally be impossible to enforce. Like they couldn't if they wanted to. However, the government can stop you from producing your own legal tender. As a matter of fact, I'm kind of surprised that Mr. Wolff didn't pick up on this, since it's usually the left that argues that Bitcoin is worthless because you can't use it to pay taxes. Which is absolutely absurd, but keeping the video within scope. So what Dr. Wolff here is advocating for is immoral. Initiating force against someone who hasn't hurt anybody. There's no victim when you compete and provide a similar service. It's also a consistency problem. I know for a fucking fact, that if any private business ever even attempted to say, do not compete with us or we'll hurt you, this Richard Wolff guy would be up in arms crying, that's a monopoly, we need the government to get involved. So it's this typical religious deification of government where they're superhuman, they're above the rest of us, we get rules that they don't have to follow. So not only is it immoral and illogical to ban private currency, it's also fucking impossible. There's no way it can be done. It's been tried. Countries like Russia, China, and Venezuela actually tried banning cryptocurrency, and guess what? Those are the countries where it's most valuable. So point being is that Richard's head is simply up his ass when he tries saying that the government should be the only one who's allowed to make currency.
So the government is awfully important, isn't it? By having been given the control, the origination power for money.
The fact that the government has the exclusive right to create money doesn't mean it's important in this regard. All it means is that they get to bully anyone who tries to compete with them. You have yet to explain why exactly it is that it's not possible for private individuals to voluntarily create a currency that competes with one another, because that's the underlying assumption that this claim that the government is important for making money rests on.
But let me give you some others. Here in the United States, the government took the land from the Native Americans and distributed it to other people.
I like how he makes it out to be as if the government forcibly removing people from their property and basically stealing it from them against their will is like a good thing. That's one of government's miraculous achievements that we should be grateful for.
The economic effect of that, staggering. Staggering.
Correct. The economic effect of that was staggering, but you know what else was staggering? The human toll. in death, bloodshed, misery, suffering. You know, I bet if someone went up to Mr. Wolff here and said, hey, we're forcing you out of your home, we're forcibly taking your home from you against your will because of your skin color, background, whatever, but don't worry, it's going to have a very staggering effect on the economy. I have a feeling that Mr. Wolff here wouldn't find that too big of a consolation.
The government controls the waterways. The government controls traffic into and out of the country. The government controls the movement of people into and out of the country.
Well, yes, Mr. Wolff, I'm well aware that the government does in fact do these things. What I would like to know is the justification or necessity for the government doing these things. You can't just tell me the government does this and from that extrapolate that we need the government to do that. As I've explained previously, that's the is-ought fallacy. It's not sufficient that you tell me what the government does, you also have to explain why it does it, or more specifically, why it should do it. I'm also a little bit shocked that he's defending border control. I thought the left was all about open borders.
The government sets limits on weights and measures and makes sure the scale in the butcher shop is accurate and not swindling us.
So does the government have some kind of unique ability to do this? Is verifying the accuracy of a scale some sort of mystical supernatural power that must be vested by God himself? Well, I personally wouldn't go to a butcher shop if I knew they were swindling people, and I'm sure most people wouldn't either. So given this, bearing this in mind, I think we would be safe to assume that most store owners would have an incentive to make sure that the measures that their scales give out are verified. Also, I love how being overcharged a little bit at the grocery store deli is this horrible, heinous offense that must be stopped at all costs, while forcibly removing people from their land and basically stealing it from them. Hey, that's no big deal. Well, those Native Americans who were basically forced off their land and told they'd be given small amounts of reservation space in return, I mean, weren't they kind of swindled as well? But yeah, this is a regular thing with authoritarians. What's right or wrong is based on what's convenient for them.
We've brought the government in.
Whoa, hold on a second. What do you mean by we? I never brought the government into anything. I was never consulted or addressed on whether or not to bring government into anything. I think the government kind of arbitrarily brought itself in. And Larkin Rose points this out in one of his videos, but one of the things that's most concerning about democracy is that people are going to be much more likely to buy something. They're going to be less skeptical of it if they believe that it's reflective of the will of the people. Basically what that entails is that politicians can basically do whatever the hell they want and the people will buy it as long as they believe that the government is acting in their interest or that the government is doing something based on a request rather than their own arbitrary whims. It's a type of pass the buck strategy where politicians can just shift the blame onto the public. They can say, oh, well, we're just giving you what you wanted. We're just giving you what you asked for.
To check on food and drug to make sure it's pure.
So how many times have you turned on the TV and you've seen a commercial for a law firm advertising litigatory services against some pharmaceutical company for a drug they released that caused a lot of harm? Pretty dang often. And of course in these commercials the attorneys are usually talking about going after the pharmaceutical company, but if you think about it, wasn't it the FDA's job to prevent those drugs from entering the market in the first place? Didn't the FDA skimp on its responsibility by allowing this drug into the marketplace? Wouldn't that make them the negligent party and therefore the one that should be on the receiving end of the lawsuit? Well, the thing about that is it's actually impossible to sue the FDA. There's no way to do it. Now compare this with a private company like Underwriters Laboratories, which provides a similar service, inspecting things for safety, passing off on it. If they negligently pass off on an unsafe product, you can sue them. You can hold them responsible.
You know why? Because capitalists adulterated it. On and on.
The actual capitalists, the people who actually believe in private ownership and voluntary agreements, didn't adulterate anything. The people who adulterated capitalism are the corporatists who insist that the government artificially get involved and give them special benefits over their competition. Just about everything that Mr. Wolff here has been clamoring on for in this video, these monolithic regulatory agencies with virtually no way to hold them responsible. Who do you think wanted those? Who do you think benefits the most from those? Here's a hint. It's not the little guy who can't afford lobbyists and lawyers to try and either influence them or skirt their regulations.
Capitalism has always needed a powerful government.
Well, as I've mentioned before, this is false. There's been private ownership and voluntary trade arguably as long as human civilization has been around. But even if we assume that it's true, that capitalism has always required a big government in order to function, you can't necessarily from that draw the conclusion that capitalism must then necessarily have big government in order to function, because that would be the appeal to tradition fallacy. Just because something has always been done a certain way doesn't necessarily mean that that's the only possible way it can be done. Take cars, for example. Basically, for the longest time, cars have always required gasoline in order to run. But that doesn't necessarily mean that that always has to be the case. We can have cars that run on batteries or hydrogen or shit like that. And the funny thing is that the use of the appeal to tradition fallacy is particularly strange coming from the left, because they're usually the biggest ones who talk about change and progress and moving forward.
We need an apparatus to prevent us from killing one another and stealing from one another. And likewise, from having folks outside come in and steal our stuff, etc.
So here's basically the logic he's using here. In order to prevent people from being able to steal and kill each other, we should have an organization of people with the exclusive right to steal and murder.
So the notion of a capitalism without a government has only one adjective that really applies. It is a utopian fantasy.
Well, of course, Mr. Wolff, you are entitled to your opinion at the end of the day. Personally, in my opinion, I think that an organization with a monopoly on force, with guaranteed funding and no way to hold it responsible, is the best way to solve all our problems, is a utopian fantasy, but that's just me. As always, this has been Philosophossum, making stupidity play dead. Have a good one.